Hi, my name is Bryan Kam, and I'm a writer and podcaster, as well as an Interintellect host. And I'm extremely excited to be joined today by Edward Slingerland, distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, where he also holds appointments in the departments of psychology and Asian studies. And in this context, he's also the author of Drunk, which is a book that I've read quite recently. And I was lucky enough to meet you in person, Edward, for an event in London.
Yeah, I'm glad that worked out.
Yeah, so would you like to introduce the book and just sort of how you got into writing about the history of alcohol?
Sure. Yeah, my background is in early Chinese philosophy and comparative religion, so it's a slightly odd topic for me to be writing on. But it actually, there's a direct connection between my earlier work and this book. So my other trade book. So I've written several academic books that no one's ever read. But the my other trade book that was meant to be read by real human beings is called Trying Not to Try, and it's about my early academic work with these early Chinese thinkers who were held as this ideal, the state of that's wu wei in Chinese. So I translate it as effortless action. But it's a state where you lose a sense of yourself as an agent, you lose a sense of the passage of time, you're completely absorbed in what you're doing, you're spontaneous, and everything works out. You're People like you, you're charismatic, you're successful in the world. Yeah, Wu-wei, Wuwei is how it's spelled. Um, but this is where they want you to be. They want you to get into this state of effortless ease, if you want to put it that way. The problem they have is captured in the title of the book. How can you try not to try? So it seems that trying to be spontaneous is counterproductive, that it'll actually prevent you from being spontaneous. And so in the book, I talk about various reasons, various strategies they come up with for getting around this tension. And it's a real tension. So I also talk about the cognitive science of effortlessness and why it's directly paradoxical to try not to try. Because if I say to you, relax, you're being too tense, you're talking too much, relax. The part of your brain that I'm activating, roughly the prefrontal cortex, is actually the part we're trying to shut down. So the paradox is very similar to the late social psychologist Dan Wegner talked about the white bear paradox. If I say don't think of a white bear, you think of a white bear because I've just activated the concept in your brain. It's the same problem with trying not to try directly. So how do you get around it? The early Chinese come up with a bunch of strategies for this. So sit in meditation, do these rituals, contemplate these paradoxical sayings. They have all sorts of techniques that are in some ways similar to, if you think about if you have insomnia and you're trying to fall asleep, you're tired, but your brain's spinning. This is the paradox of trying not to try. How do you try to relax and go to sleep? Counting sheep is a bit like the Confucian strategy. If you want to think of it that way, they give you something to do that takes your mind off the fact that you're trying, and then that kind of can trick you into relaxing. But what occurred to me at one point in writing that book, I talk about this early, you're and my favorite philosopher, Zhuangzi, this analogy he uses between a drunken person and the Taoist sage. So they've kind of lost a sense of passage of time, sense of themselves. They can kind of roll with things. And it's clearly just an analogy in the Zhuangzi. He says, if you can get drunk, if you can be like this, if your spirit can be whole, literally is how he puts it, through wine, how much more so if you're drunk on heaven, if you're drunk on the spiritual power. But that made me start to think, well, alcohol is actually not too bad. Being drunk on heaven is awesome, but maybe it's the case that cultures have figured out that they can use this technology, this chemical intoxicant, as a tool to get around the paradox of Wu, the paradox of trying not to try. So we want people to be in this spontaneous state and enjoy all the benefits of having charisma and trust, and all the things you get with Wu. maybe we can, since directly using your mind to shut your mind down doesn't work, maybe we use a chemical substance to do that job for us. Because one of the main functions of alcohol physiologically is to downregulate the prefrontal cortex. So that's one connection to my previous work. And then the other is just that I've long been interested in problematizing things that don't seem problematic. So earlier in my career, I did this with religion. So everywhere we look around the world throughout history, we see people worshiping invisible beings and sacrificing wealth to them and going through painful rituals for them and cutting off the foreskins of their penises and burying a good percentage of gross national product in the ground with dead people and building these big useless monuments. Why? I mean, we just see that happening and we're like, oh yeah, people do that. But it's puzzling. When you start to look at things from an evolutionary perspective, it's puzzling. And so my colleagues and I had a multi-year project where we were looking at this in a variety of ways and argued that these costs have to be paying for themselves somehow. So it has to be the case that there are benefits that accrue to individuals and cultural groups that engage in religious behavior and entertain religious beliefs, or they would be outcompeted by individuals who did and groups that didn't. So we made a case for evolutionary functions of this apparently useless behavior, because most religious behavior has no practical use. When I started to think about alcohol, I basically had the same feeling that we look around the world and throughout history, whenever people get together, there's a treaty that needs to be signed, or there's a important thing to be celebrated, they drink, or they use some other chemical intoxicant that has a very similar function. And yet, from an evolutionary perspective, this is puzzling because alcohol is very costly to us physiologically. It's bad for the liver, it increases your cancer risk, it can lead to all sorts of social disorders. It's a dangerous substance, it's physically addictive. Why have all around the world throughout history do people use this chemical intoxicant to essentially poison themselves? It's a poison that our body tries to break down and get out of our bodies as quickly as possible. And I came to feel that it's a similar story as with religion, that there are these hidden benefits that are paying for the cost. And that's why it's remained in our genetic repertoire and our cultural repertoire. And so that's the drunk starts off with this basic question of why do we like to get drunk? And the simple answer is, well, because it makes us feel good. But that's a kind of superficial answer. It's the deeper question is, why does evolution allow it to make us feel good? And it's possible that it doesn't have a choice, that it's a mistake that it hasn't been able to correct yet. And so I spend the first part of the book debunking some of these mistake theories, evolutionary mistake theories. So the standard story that you'll read in a Psych 101 textbook is that our taste for alcohol is an evolutionary hijack. So it's just ethanol happens to hijack this reward network in the brain. And there are evolutionary hijack examples that explain vices we have. So I start the book with masturbation, the classic evolutionary hijack. We have this reward that's the best reward that evolution has is the orgasm. It's so good that everything else gets compared to that. Right, a meal that's good is orgasmic. It's the only thing we can think of that's the best, and that's because it's a reward for what our genes want us to do the most, which is pass on copies of themselves to the next generation. But humans and other species have figured out a way to game the system and figured out various ways to get that reward through so the adaptive target of that reward is reproductive sex, passing on genes to the next generation. We figured out all sorts of ways to get that reward in wildly non-reproductive ways, and other species have as well. So why doesn't evolution do something about this? In this case, this type of evolutionary mistake, it's important to realize it's not very costly. So despite what you may have heard, masturbation doesn't make you go blind, doesn't hurt your liver. It doesn't have really any negative physiological impacts. Um, and the overall system works pretty well. So despite masturbation and everything else we get up to, we still engage in reproductive sex often enough for the system to work. And evolution doesn't care about getting things perfect. It just is happy with good enough. So relatively costless mistake. Another type of mistake is a mismatch. And this is where something used to be adaptive in our evolutionary past, but now it's costly. And the classic example of this is our taste for junk food. So we love to gorge on sugar and fat, and this was adaptive and for most of our evolutionary history because sugar and fat were hard to get. We should gorge on them whenever we get them. It's only become a problem very recently and only in industrial societies where we have access to 7-Elevens full of ice cream and chips and these things that are very costly, right? They lead to obesity, diabetes. Um, so in the case of junk food, this type of mismatch, it's very costly, but it's super recent. It's last 100 years maybe, and relatively small part of the population. Even today, there are plenty of places. Right now, there are plenty of places where it's hard. It's a challenge to get enough calories. So in this case, it's costly but recent. So evolution hasn't had any reason to deal with it because it hasn't had time. So the standard story is that our taste for alcohol, I think 95% of the accounts you'll read is that it's the first type of mistake. It's a hijack, like masturbation. But unlike masturbation, it's extremely costly. It has got all these individual and social costs. So there are some mismatch theories running around. And the problem with those is that our taste, unlike our taste for junk food, our taste for alcohol is ancient. We've been producing and consuming alcohol for as long as we've been doing anything in an organized fashion as a species. Probably at least 20,000 years ago, and almost certainly older than that. So it's been around this. If it's a mistake, it's been around long enough for evolution to deal with it, and it hasn't. So what's going on there? And so the bulk of the book is then walking through all of the various possible functions that evolution, that drinking, the taste for drinking could be serving, the benefits that pay for the costs. And I argue that these benefits are what has kept the taste for alcohol in our both in our gene pool and in our cultural repertoire. So that's the kind of short spiel on what the motivation for the book was and what the central arguments are.
Right. And so there's much of the rest of the book, as opposed to these hangover or hijack theories, which tend to emphasize the kind of uselessness of alcohol, right? Your book is actually defending the many benefits that alcohol has played over both quite long and maybe more recent evolutionary time. Is that a good summary?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, right, and even today, the dominant model when we talk about alcohol is just this medicalized model. So, I talk about there have been a couple of recent pieces in the Lancet. There was one from a few years back that argued that the only safe level of alcohol consumption is 0. No one should drink. There's a more recent one, this came out a few months ago, I think, arguing that people under 40 shouldn't drink because there are all these net negative consequences, but there might be some mild benefits for people over 40. And if you read the article, it basically is like, after 40, whatever, you're basically dead anyway. So if you want to have a little bit to drink, why not? But if you're
was
young,
this written by somebody above 40?
Yeah, so whatever, we're evolutionarily dead ends. So, but you young people who actually have some life ahead of you, you shouldn't be using alcohol. And the problem with this is it's really just looking at physiological impact, and that's just a very narrow way to look at it. And I think this is a problem for public discourse. Is just I think that ordinary people have an intuitive feeling that they use alcohol for reasons, for good reasons, for functional reasons, but we're not very articulate about that. And so in the face of doctors telling us, it's only safe level of consumption 0, we're like, okay, well, I guess we shouldn't drink. So I'm trying to change the public discourse about alcohol by pointing out that you have all this stuff in the negative column that we know about and we talk about endlessly: the negative physiological effects, addiction, alcoholism, social disorder that it can cause. And that's all we ever talk about. And that's important to talk about. But we also over here have these positives, individual and social benefits. And we need to see both in order to make an intelligent decision about what the role of alcohol should be, both in our personal lives and in our professional organizations, if we run organizations. So I just want and you may at the end of the day say, you know what, I see all the possible benefits, but I don't want alcohol in my life. And how you make that decision could depend on your individual risk factors, your individual history. But the only way to make an intelligent decision is to have all the information at your disposal.
Right. And intoxication, you write, is cultural universal. So even if cultures don't use, it's obviously not an individual universal. So even like every culture on earth has some way of getting intoxicated, even if not everyone within that culture does so. But also that alcohol, I think, is the most common. And you think it has it's quite distinct from things like nicotine in your view, as well as caffeine, as well as some of these other more potent intoxicants. Is that right?
Well, nicotine and caffeine are not intoxicants. So that's crucial to separate stimulants from intoxicants. So caffeine and nicotine are friends of the prefrontal cortex, if you want to think about this, right? If they strengthen your ability to focus, I mean, I'm drinking caffeine now because I want to focus, right? I need to wake up. This is helping me be task oriented. So that's a whole different class of drug, essentially, and that's not what the book's about. If you want to think of the Apollo Dionysus dichotomy I set up, caffeine and nicotine are the servants of Apollo. Intoxicants are things that downregulate your prefrontal cortex, stimulate feel-good hormones, and so are stimulants and depressants at the same time, but in a way that interfere with your normal goal-directed activity. So I'm talking about intoxicants in general. And then among intoxicants, I do think that alcohol, at the end of the day, if you gave a cultural evolutionary design team the task of coming up with a substance that has these design specs, it has to be super easy to make, easy to discover, need to be able to make it out of anything. It should have very consistent cognitive effects across individuals. It should affect everyone the same way. It should have a short half-life, so it'll affect you, but 2 hours later, you're completely fine again. They would come up with alcohol. There's really no other intoxicant that has the same set of design specs. So cannabis, for instance, is superior to alcohol in a bunch of ways. It's not physiologically as harmful and it's not physically addictive, but it has really variable effects across individuals. So I have friends who smoke in order to be social and go out and party and talk about philosophy. When I consume cannabis, I get really paranoid, and I think everything I'm saying is stupid, and everyone's talking about me, and then I fall asleep. So it's like not super useful as a social drug for me. And we know this about cannabis. It has variable effects across individuals. It's also really hard to dose. If you're smoking it, it's hard to know exactly how much you're getting. If you're doing edibles, the onset is so long that it's hard to dose. People do this all the time with overdose with edibles because they take some, they're like, I don't feel anything, and they take more, and then it just boom hits them. Whereas alcohol, you have a sip of beer, and like within a minute what it's done to you. So immediate feedback, dosage wise, and very consistent effects across individuals. So yeah, I think there's a reason that alcohol is the most common cross-cultural drug. I'm really bad at multitasking, so I'll leave it to you, Bryan, to look at the chats and bring things in when
Yes.
people have something to say, because I can't respond to chat.
No, that's completely fine. I'm the same way, but I will keep an eye on the chat. I would love to invite people either to raise their hands or to jump in and start asking questions. But while we do that, I'd like to ask about the sort of social benefits, because you talk about sort of trust and group bonding.
Well, Anna's got her hand up.
Oh yeah, sorry. Let's bring Anna in.
Just a comment. I never thought about this. I'm also drinking coffee. I never thought about this this Dionysian, Apollonian, Nietzschean aspect to it, but it makes total sense to me that people use substances to switch between archetypes. Like if you read, I love Jane Shinoda Bolen's book, Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman, where she, a Jungian psychologist, argues that the whole purpose of the Olympian gods was to kind of personify internal processes that everybody has. So if you're going hunting, you should pray to Artemis. But if you're trying to seduce somebody, pray to Aphrodite. If you're giving birth, you have to wake up the hero in you. And we try to do this with self-help, and it's kind of clunky, but people have been kind of doing this with substances since forever, right? Yeah. Oh, you have to be really Apollonian because you have a board meeting, but now you want to go out with your friends and it has to be a peer thing. You have to blend in, and you want the Dionysian part. And I never thought about this, but this is amazing. And it's to me completely, because I think we think about alcohol it used to be this ritual thing, and now today you're cooking and drinking in the kitchen. Yeah, right. Yeah. Whereas no, you're actually you do the same thing. You're using a ritual with a substance to switch between archetypes, because it's super, super, super hard to switch between archetypes, especially quickly and alone.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. So people do this usually unconsciously. They're using different types of substances for different purposes. Coffee in the morning to get yourself going. You're going to go to work and you're going to have to solve A goes to B goes to C type tasks. You have to resist temptation, so you have to be goal directed and not distracted by things. But then you need to switch, right? And so it's also universal that people use alcohol to flip from goal-directed everyday activity to looser social activity, and to kind of mark. And it is, it's not. We think of rituals as these kind of big things with lots of pageantry. Rituals can be very small. So coming back home from work and pouring yourself a glass of wine is a type of ritual. And it's the act of doing that is actually having an effect on you already. So we do this consciously and unconsciously.
I love this. And we also do this to each other. The boss who just quietly places a new Nespresso machine in your way, oh, here are our in-laws and they hate each other, drink,
Yeah, exactly.
That's really great.
Yeah.
Switch archetypes,
Yes. Quickly. Yeah, no, we've all done that. And so, now I'm hoping that with drunk and kind of understanding what the actual differing cognitive functions and adaptive advantages are to different drugs, we can be more conscious of what we're doing, which is helpful.
Isabella, would you like to come in? I think you were going to build on something I was saying, but I'm happy for you to ask your way.
Okay, so I have lots and lots of questions. I will try not to ask them all in this one go. So maybe what I wanted to start with is, because you're talking about a lot of this sort of switching on and off in a sort of conscious, intentional way, right? And so I'm a developmentalist, and in particular, affective neuroscience was my thing for a long while. And so emotions are my thing for a long while. And I think much of the time, I wish it was the case that we do think these things so consciously, intentionally, and individually, developmentally, adaptively. But I think oftentimes what happens is we're super stressed and we just need the drink to get out of our, context, or to give us some sort of bravery so that we can ask, the hot guy out or whatever, right? So where I'm going with this will eventually, I want to talk with you a little bit about in your book about how you differentiate sort of developmental purposes of drinking, like in one's individual lifetime or a family's lifetime versus evolutionary times. But first, the focus that you have on this dualism, you have at a point somewhere halfway through the book, you say, part of the reason why people are, and you just said it now, part of the reason why people have such a hard time talking about alcohol is that people need to be very black and white, very dualistic about it. And you want to kind of fight that, right? And say that there are these different functions, especially evolutionarily, but even individually. And you at first talk about it as a mind-body thing, right? That people just have a hard time even thinking about mind-body dualism, never mind all these other issues. And I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's a great insight of the book about why people have a hard time thinking about alcohol in ways that have these differential impacts. But I also think that people have a hard time thinking about alcohol because of this dichotomy between joy and sorrow as well. So as you mentioned, in the biochemical effect of alcohol, you have not only the upper, but you also have the depressant, right? And it is both in that kind of joyful, round of drinks where you're singing with people, but then also end up, you can tell I'm Eastern European, end up crying with each other and singing, the Leonard Cohen songs by the end of the day. That has this incredibly bonding effect. And it is the movement and the sort of, to some extent, being able to control the movement from those affective states that is super powerful and to some extent bonding, and also beautiful about the effects of alcohol. And it allows us to be sort of melancholy and allow our sorrow parts to come out in a way that's really quite, that feels still correct and acceptable in a public space. And I just wondered if that at all feels right to you. And I felt like you were almost going there in parts of the book, and then it didn't quite flip to that. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah. There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
So
she warned us. She was like, I have so much to say.
That's true. We were warned. There's, alcohol is historically always used socially. It's very rare to have private access to alcohol. And it's used in these along with ritual in a way that's synergistic. And so, we have informal versions of this, like the getting together with the friends or relatives in a pub and drinking and ending up singing Leonard Cohen together. There's a kind of trajectory to the evening that everyone understands. There's appropriate and inappropriate things. So, we don't think about this, but no one would say, hey, let's now go for a jog. Let's do some calisthenics. It's just like there's certain things, or even just let's take a break and read a book. And everyone would be like, what's the matter with you? Don't you know how these events work? So we're not explicit about it, but we have an implicit sense of how the ritual works. And you're right, it's a way to both express and regulate emotions. And alcohol is facilitating that because of its, the kind of, I quote Stephen Brown's observation that it's kind of pharmacological hand grenade. It's going in and doing all these things at once. But the crucial thing, I think, is the downregulation, the PFC, and the disinhibition that we need sometimes to express our emotions to others, to even experience emotions ourselves. And different people, can kind of strategically use alcohol. I talk at one point about how introverts, there's some evidence that introverts use alcohol to help in social situations because it makes you more extroverted. It's boosting these feel-good hormones, and suddenly, you want to talk to people and you don't want to talk. And I totally relate to that. I'm a serious introvert, and I definitely unconsciously have always used alcohol this way. So yeah, it's an emotional regulator, and we're using it in very conscious ways to do that.
Lucas, and then I wanted to invite Zarina to read out one of the comments that she made after that.
Yeah, so before I ask my question, I should add something to my introduction. So I'm one of those probably weird people who has at some point decided, okay, the only amount of alcohol I want in my body is absolutely zero, and I have never made an exception to that rule, and I'm not planning to. And so I was like really reading this book from the perspective as an outsider to understand, okay, why are other people drinking? And I must admit, it has given me quite this, okay, I'm probably missing out on some essential parts of what it means to be part of society. It still hasn't changed my mind on this. So my question is related to this, and so what you've also mentioned in the book is that, and I think I'm not sure if it was you or Bryan who said like very nicely earlier that so alcohol is kind of like part of every culture, but it's not like part of like every individual in every culture. So they have always, like in every culture, alcohol consumption is like part of certain rituals, or it exists in some way, but it's like it's never that everyone participates in those. So there are always these people like myself who kind of opt out of this. And I'm curious if during your research you have also seen like who are these people, how is it possible to say, okay, it's like typically like a certain group of society who doesn't participate, and what kind of like rewards or punishments, or like how is the relationship between those people, because they are probably like they might be excluded from some parts, like if alcohol is like considered essential to certain let's keep using that term, rituals, how does it mean like the other people are treated in these situations? If there's like also any interesting cultural differences around this.
Yeah, so there is a kind of cross-cultural pattern where people are suspicious of non-drinkers. So I talk about the Greek suspicion of water, kind of what they contemptuously called water drinkers, and people who didn't drink wine. I quote some, contemporary ethnographic literature on people who are suspicious of the person in the room who's not drinking at these events. And I talk about, so what's the reason for that? And the kind of, I think the ultimate kind of cultural evolutionary reason is that when you're drinking, when you're at these festivals and you're drinking, we're all cognitively disarming. So I'm taking my PFC and putting it out on the table and saying, I don't have cognitive control anymore. It would almost, so I think the person then who's not drinking, it's almost like if we all come in and we lay down our weapons and you're the guy who still has a sword in his hand. We're kind of like, why does that guy still have a sword in his hand? We all put our swords down. You're the one who's not cognitively disarmed. And so I think that's the origin of that. And this is the challenge we have, is how, but then of course there are people who don't drink for all sorts of great reasons, right? They don't. They have a family history of alcoholism. They have just seen alcoholism close up and don't want to have anything to do with alcohol. It might be for religious reasons. You might be pregnant and not want to drink for very good health reasons. So we can understand kind of really scientifically, so for cooperation reasons, why this prejudice against non-drinkers, non-participants in the ritual in that sense, might exist, while still as humans saying, well, that's not fair, and so how do we fix that, or what are the ways we can mitigate that problem? So I do talk at the end about how as organizations you can try to level the playing field between drinkers and non-drinkers. I think one of the best innovations recently, relatively recently in that regard, is really good tasting non-alcoholic beers and cocktails. And I was at an event recently with somebody who had stopped drinking for very good personal reasons. But it was an event in a bar or pub, and everyone's drinking because that's what you're doing. And yet this person could order a non-alcoholic beer and look like everyone else and blend in and be part of the group and not be stigmatized without having to put alcohol in their body. So I think one way you do it is by giving people real, legitimate, non-alcoholic options so that they don't have to sit there with a Coca-Cola and look different from everyone else. But it's a tricky thing. If everyone is disarming cognitively and one person's not, that group's going to be a little worried about them. This is also problematic because I talk about the fact that this kind of bonding that happens over alcohol historically has really been unfair for let's say women. So it's especially traditionally male dominated events, right? You got a bunch of guys getting drunk. I, as a young woman, don't want to wander into that or participate in that. And yet if I don't, I miss out on all these networking opportunities that happen. Everyone at the end of the evening at the conference is getting drunk at the hotel bar. There's some important networking happening there. People are talking about, oh, I have this postdoc available. Oh, I didn't know you had a postdoc. Hey, I've got the student. All the stuff happens there. I'm a parent of a young child, and I can't stay up, but I can't go to the bar after the conference is over. I have to go back to the room and take care of my kid. Or I have to go home because I have to get up early, deal with something. So it disadvantages groups of people in a really unfair way. And so that's another trick you have to figure out, is how to make those events less exclusionary and less kind of less advantageous for only certain demographics and not others. And I give some suggestions. I also talk about some suggestions from people who are worried about this professionally in the workplace, but it is an issue.
And if I recall, there's something in your book, not just about putting your PFC on the table in the sense of inhibiting your own ability to lie, but it has some effect on your ability to detect whether others are lying. Is that right?
Yeah. So so lying is a PFC heavy undertaking, right? If I'm lying to you about something, I have to be in the moment tracking what's really true, which I just happen to know, and then what I'm telling you is true, which is really hard to keep track of because it's false. I can't just check reality, right? I've got to remember this made up world I constructed in my head, and I've got to make sure that my reactions, emotional reactions, my facial expressions are tracking that made up thing I'm telling you and not the real thing. It's really very PFC demanding. So if you can downregulate the PFC, you make it harder to do that. That's the disarming part. But yeah, what's less obvious is that we're better at detecting lies when our PFC is downregulated. And this seems to be because we think we know what the tells are, but we don't. So if we're drinking coffee and we're like, oh yeah, I read in a book that I should see if their eyebrow twitches, there actually is no one good tell of when someone's lying. And it seems to be the case that once you downregulate your PFC a bit, because you're not trying anymore, you're better at detecting lies. And probably because you're taking in a broader range of data than you would if you thought you knew what you were doing.
Trying not to try, and you
trying not to try is better. Yeah.
Yeah. Zarina, you had a comment in the chat that I thought maybe you could bring into the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, just thinking about alcohol, it reminded me of Michael Pollan and his book Cooked, which is about how people cook food and the agriculture generally. And so one of his theories is that agricultural plant species like wheat, for example, or soybeans, have domesticated us. And so we often think that man that has domesticated, various, plant species and so on to grow them for agriculture. And so for Michael Pollan, it's the other way around. It's that these species have found a way to make us work hard to reproduce, to grow these plants in huge quantities and to make them win from an evolutionary perspective. And so when we think about alcohol and how it behaves, or I guess what it makes us do, so it really, when we consume it, it drives us to do things that we wouldn't normally do, as you said earlier. It changes our behavior. It's a behavior. It's not like it has a purpose, but it's as if it had the purpose to reproduce itself and to make us grow and grow and process alcoholic products. It just in nature, it just reminds people of these parasites that get into a host and then make it do almost suicidal things to get eaten by a bigger thing or do something that is beneficial for the parasite. And it's as if I won't go as far as to say it has this purpose, but it's like it really found a sweet spot to reproduce itself and grow itself in huge quantities.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You've always got to consider those stories, right? And so there's an equivalent story like that for religion. One of the theories about why we have religious belief and practices is basically a kind of mind parasite story. So, there is no good, it's not good for us, it's good for the ideas. It's this meme theory of religion. And to kind of balance out those competing hypotheses, you have to look at, who is this behavior serving? What units of, that selection can act on are being benefited by these things. At the end of the day, I know Pollan's argument about agriculture. It's a very provocative way to think about it. I'm not sure I buy it, but it would basically go twice as much for alcohol as agriculture, because alcohol is what started agriculture. So, in the book, I talk about the beer before bread hypothesis, that it was this desire to get together and get intoxicated that gave rise to agriculture, not that figuring out beer was a side product of agriculture. And then once we do, these hunter-gatherers are motivated to settle down and start growing grains. Alcohol was a tool that kind of helped them deal with that transition, reducing stress, making it possible for them to cooperate on a large scale. You could tell a version of that story where, the first hunter-gatherer tastes some fermented grains, and that substance takes over his brain or her brain. It gets them to start, getting together and doing festivals, so people will drink more beer. You could tell a kind of flipped version of this whole history where alcohol domesticated humans rather than the other way around, because it did radically change our lifestyle in a way that maybe wasn't ideal for most individuals. Certainly there were, most archaeologists and anthropologists feel like the transition from hunter-gatherer to lifestyle to settled agriculture resulted in net negative impacts for most individuals. And that's only flipped relatively recently.
Anna, you have your hand up. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, I had a comment like way earlier. I don't know how relevant it is, but as you were talking, I think it was before Lucas, about the kind of transition moment. This sentence from Antal Serb's book Journey by Moonlight came to my mind, which I had never thought of. And I used to work in music and manage rock bands and was out all night. And I definitely had seen a bunch of people drunk in my career. Yeah. There's this moment where he talks about this moment at a party. It's a big garden party in the 1930s. When people kind of give up. Like up to that point, you think that you will go to bed and that you're a good citizen. And then there's a moment when that social obligation of normalcy, of the normal kind of circadian rhythm, when everybody is kind of realistic, it's like 1:30. I don't know what it is for you, but you're like, I will be effed up tomorrow. So whatever happens in the next like 5 hours, I can either go home or I can go home in 5 hours and it's the same results. So I better make these 5 hours good. And I think all of us here probably have had the best conversations, best experiences, and some of the worst experiences in those 5 hours. And I think that there is a level of abandon to this that is kind of under discussed. It's almost like, I don't get to be a nihilist in my life because I'm a mission-driven startup founder, and I, put my future on the line every day, and it's really, really important. But like, you get this little slice of childhood, post-apocalyptic, fully Sartrean, I don't know, nihilistic person to be. And then it's kind of socially accepted. So tomorrow still, you will recover, but you can kind of go back to your normal self. And I don't know what the evolutionary benefits of this is, but I'm sure it's almost like sleeping and dreaming weird stuff. Like you almost get a holiday from yourself without too high costs. I mean, unless you're going insane.
Yeah. No, I talk about the importance of ecstasy and the Greek sense of kind of getting outside yourself, and this idea of a holiday from the self, right? We need a vacation from the self. It's not clear why. And that's something I don't think we understand, why people want to experience ecstasy periodically in this sense. And you can do it through chemical intoxicants, and people often do. You can also get it through non-chemical intoxicant means. So, you could get it through dancing all night and sleep deprivation without alcohol. You can get it through getting absorbed into something. So arguably, this is one of the things that sports fans get out of going to a game, right? They get absorbed in the game, they get absorbed in the crowd around them. This is something you can get at a rock concert, even if you're not intoxicated, right? The sense of being out of yourself. I don't think we have a good account of why people like that. There have been some books on this about the need for getting beyond the self, but I don't think we have a good evolutionary story for it. So I do mention that as one of the functions of alcohol. It's one of the things that facilitates this kind of vacation for the self or vacation from ordinary life. But why we need that is unclear. And maybe you're right, the kind of good analogy would be sleep. We need this kind of, if people who are awake, stay awake, go insane, right? That's the best way to drive someone insane, is to deprive them of sleep for an extended period. We seem to need this downtime. So maybe this is this kind of rejuvenating thing for the self to shut itself down every once in a while.
I love this one. And kind of just to go back to this transition moment, you said earlier that, and I never thought about this, that alcohol works as self-medication maybe better than marijuana, because you can pace yourself. I think, at least when I lived in London, like I could see guys literally decide, do I want to be a human tomorrow or not? Mm-hmm. And you actually decide how many pints you buy. And people who have been doing this for a long time know how, mostly they know how to pace themselves. But then there's still this kind of magical, invisible transition moment, the same way as when you're falling asleep, you don't actually, because what changes it what you're observing the change with. So you don't really notice, unless you're doing shots and counting, what is the moment when you're out of the utility tyranny of everyday life. And to me, this contradiction is really, really interesting. So I have a mysterious transition moment at some point with my friends or alone, when I leave some of my worries behind and I'm in this different state, and I have control over it, or at least more control than almost with anything else other than prescription medication, but it's still very elusive. Mm-hmm. It's only in retrospect when you're like, I did that karaoke and wow, did I do that?
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, we seem to have a need for that, or at least most people do. But again, there's different ways to get it. So some people get it through sports fandom, and there's lots of ways you can get it.
One thing it made me think of, just sort of thinking aloud, because it's about sort of downregulating the prefrontal cortex, and that's one of the later things that you get in life. I think you sort of say that it comes about in your 20s, and you talk about neoteny and sort of the possibility that you know, it's humans have this very long, quite plastic phase of development, right? And so could it be something like a return to that period is advantageous in some way, or something like that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so I talked about the fact that, evolution has this design trade-off it's got to deal with, where it wants us to have a PFC. The PFC is really important. It allows us to be successful adults and resist distractions and get to work on time and all these really crucial things that a 4-year-old can't do. But it also interferes with lateral thinking, creativity. It shuts down trust. It makes us less resistant to learning new things. And so it's one of the reasons that it slow walks. So one way it responded to this design trade-off problem is slow walking the PFC development, right? It's the last part of our brain to develop. It's, if you think about it, it's the last part of a human to develop. You're in your 20s, you're perfectly physically matured in every way, except this one thing is still not fully matured. So it takes a really long time to get the PFC fully online. And that's probably because it's trying to get all the advantages of not having a fully developed PFC. Openness to learning, openness to new experience, lateral thinking. But yeah, once we're kind of stuck, once we pass the mid-20s and we're stuck with a fully developed PFC, alcohol is then this technology we can use to turn back the developmental clock a bit, and get back to a state where we recapture some of these benefits. We are more trusting, we're more open to new things, we can think laterally in these various ways. So yeah, it's a technique for undoing development temporarily, and the nice thing about it is it does have a short half-life. So 2 hours later, you're back to being a 40-year-old again. So with all the knowledge and the abilities and the things that you have as a fully grown adult.
Zan, I wanted to bring you in. I think you had a question about prohibiting alcohol.
Sure, thank you. I was just asking about what the explanation would be for the advantages of a religion or civilization, such as Islam, prohibiting alcohol and indeed, I believe, all intoxicants and kind of drugs of this kind, and there's some conversation with Arena in chat about how this might be related to or not to how successful the religion or civilization is at spreading itself. I'm just basically curious, like, what are the cultural evolutionary dynamics, advantages, and so on of a really successful religion and strict civilization like Islam, emphasizing that kind of prohibition. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are, my argument is that cultural groups who have used intoxicants have done better than those that haven't. But of course, there are some really important cultures that, at least in theory, prohibit intoxicants. The case of Islam is tricky because it's not fully consistent. Some of the greatest wine poetry in the world comes from Islamic Persia, right? They were drinking, the Persians drank a lot. And even today, Islamic societies vary to the degree in which they actually enforce prohibition. But then you have other groups. So you've got the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, who are pretty strict and pretty consistent about their ban on intoxicants and in fact, mind-altering drugs of many kinds, including stimulants. So I talk about this in the book. I think the way to understand prohibition in religious groups is that it's not something, basically they're taking a hit on the benefits that you get from intoxicants. And what they're getting in return is a really powerful, costly display. So what my colleagues and I who study religion from a cultural evolutionary perspective have talked about is the importance of what my colleague Joe Henrich calls creds, C-R-E-D, so credibility enhancing displays. So these are things where I say, I believe this, I believe in God, and I believe this set of texts that tells us what God wants. How can you know that I'm sincere about that? Look, I'm going to cut off the foreskin of my penis. Take that. I'm going to not eat delicious pork. I'm going to deny myself certain things. So certain types of taboos or prohibitions on pleasurable or advantageous things can be in a way beneficial functionally because they demonstrate to others that you take your beliefs seriously. So I argue in the book that the way to understand alcohol and other intoxicant prohibitions in these religions is that it's not so much about getting the benefits of not having people drinking. It's about making a sacrifice, saying and so in the case of Islam, there have been historians who've argued they're surrounded by these wine drinking Mediterranean cultures, and they want to differentiate themselves. So one way they do that is saying, we're not like them. We're not going to do this thing. And I think the same thing is going on with Mormonism. And especially in the case of Mormonism, it's significant that they're not only banning alcohol, but they're banning stimulants like caffeine and nicotine. If your goal was, what's that?
So I was actually just Googling that. I was under the same impression. But according to I think it's a Salt Lake City newspaper, but that I've just read 10 minutes ago. But the prohibition on caffeine or coffee and tea, that was an interpretation of the and I forget the name of the original Mormon prophet, the founder,
Joseph Smith.
There you go. Forbidding hot water. So and that was seen as too much. So it was reinterpreted as, he must have meant coffee and tea, i.e. caffeine.
Right.
But
Interesting.
apparently there's a current loosening and ongoing debate about that in Mormon culture, that it's officially okay to have caffeine now, but a lot of Mormons, even young Mormons, still stick to the avoiding caffeine.
Right. But so the fact that he wanted to ban hot water is even more evidence that this is really, it's about, let's do something really different from everyone else around us to demonstrate that we are the select of God, we're special people. And also by observing these onerous restrictions, I'm demonstrating to you that I actually really believe this stuff. I'm not just doing it for personal benefit. It's a costly display. So I think that's the way to understand most of the taboos and prohibitions on alcohol from a religious perspective.
Can I jump in a story, Isabella? Just because last time I lost my slot. Just two things about this. One is both Mormonism and Islam have these very significant mystical sub branches within the religion. And I think there's something really smart about saying you can have a trance experience in your life, but only through religion. Do you want to get that sense of elevation? Do you want to get that sense of collective ecstasy with your peers? Then, read the text, pray. All of Mormon architecture is about kind of getting you out of the everyday. So it reminds me also a little bit about like the marriage law, that you can have like sexual ecstasy in your life, but like with one person. Like we will try to like create a way where it's kind of channeled by the religion. And the other thing that I wanted to add, just a joke, we have this wonderful host called Alex Danko, who is a philosopher on Girard and a lot of these tech, kind of critical one, a lot of tech favorites. And he talked about the recent trend amongst Western elites of taking things seriously or proving that you're serious. And what you said really reminded me of it. So his kind of position is that we have this very, very complacent and very comfortable class who have no material needs, no real problems. Everybody has access to the same great stuff. And so how much can you make yourself suffer is like a key business asset these days. Mm-hmm. So when you had the pandemic and everybody was making bread, but some people got like really good at it. That was really, there are arguments that we will slide back to religion, and I would probably use it as an argument that, maybe it starts with weird and obscure and esoteric ways to prove to other people that you're serious. Through sacrifice.
Yeah. Right.
And random things like, who cares? Why are you making bread? You can buy it. Yeah. I mean, it makes no like economic sense, but you see what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. So your first point was about this kind of monopoly of ecstasy. And that does make sense, right? You've got religions are going to be worried about your ability to informally get a little bit of ecstasy with your friends, and they're telling you, no, you can only do it through this one path that basically we're in charge of. So that does make a lot of sense. It's a way for a religion to exercise a monopoly over this important part of human life. The costly display of sacrifice thing, there was a piece about this. I'm trying to remember who wrote this. It was about kind of the tech bros and this weird like competition over, you know what, I only need 3 hours of sleep a night, or I survived solely on blended drinks. I don't need solid foods, and it's just like, what? It's just, you have all the money and you're doing these crazy aesthetic things. And the argument is it's really no different from, Christian ascetics going into the desert and mortifying themselves. It's a way to say, I'm the real thing, because look how different I am from other humans.
But to me, that makes sense. Like, if somebody's doing it for God, I kind of get that. But if you're just flexing, I don't know.
People want to feel special.
Intermittent fasting, just so you can tweet about it, makes no sense to me.
Yeah. But it is this kind of, I'm different than other people. And how can you know that for sure? Because look at these weird things that I do. There's a kind of spiritual flexing, as you said, that shows that I think the argument in this article was it's partly a response to this outrageous wealth. Like, why should I'm 25 years old and I have $1 billion? Part of your brain's like, that doesn't seem right. Especially because the thing you are wealthy for is building, an app that people use to share animal videos. Should you really have $1 billion for that? It may partly be a response to that. Well, sure, I'm 25 and I built this kind of trivial entertainment thing, but I survived solely on blended foods, and I do Peloton for 6 hours a day, and it's a way to make yourself feel like you've earned this status that you have.
And also to self-differentiate, because there's one thing that is cultural differentiation between cultures. Like, there's the pig eating and the pig non-eating tribe with their tents next to each other in the same desert. Yeah. But then there's also this thing in certain social circles, and that's not just tech. Like, you have it in various different strands of the American intelligentsia, that you have everybody kind of wears the same things, eats the same things, lives in the same place, watches the same. How do you differentiate yourself? And we want to differentiate ourselves because we want to have competitive advantages in like mating and in careers. And people are like, okay, then I'm going to torture myself on this device in my living room that talks to me.
Yeah,
okay.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Isabella, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I'll try to get back to the okay, just as a one comment on this whole thing, it's really interesting that and unfortunate that we cannot have good science around some of this. You know, I'm partially funded by the Templeton Foundation, and so is, of course, people that you know well, I think.
I am too.
Oh, you are too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So if you look at their, you know, what they fund in terms of science of spiritual practices, there's everything kind of goes, you know, near the idea of ecstatic experiences and so on, but and the experience of sobriety and all of that, but nothing around the potential use of alcohol in these religions. So you think of Judaism, right? And, you know, Passover, and if you go through the Haggadah, you're drinking a glass of wine per like 20 minutes, whatever it is. And it does have an impact.
Catholics have to drink it every Sunday. No,
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I just find it interesting.
You just want to drink.
Yeah. So, I mean, NSF and IMH or whatever, and other science foundations I can understand, but even foundations that are not bound by government kind of things are still not really particularly, or maybe they are inside the cadre that I don't know about, Edward, but, you know, it seems to me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a problem. It's a I talk about this in the end of the book about this kind of weird neo-Puritanism, right? In cognitive science of religion, which is one of the fields I'm involved in, you know, we can study ritual and experimentally. We can study synchrony. We can study, you know, we could basically study any aspect of ritual except what almost every ritual we know of throughout history has, which is intoxicant use. You can never study intoxicant use. It's really difficult to get human subject approval for experiments that involve chemical intoxicants. That's deterred me in the past. I had some studies I wanted to do. Even, you know, NIH, I know a researcher who's done work on alcohol that's explored some of the positive pro-social benefits of alcohol, and he consciously like doesn't want to do too much of that because he wants to keep getting money from the NIH. And how do you get money from the NIH? Studies showing how bad alcohol is and doing things on mitigation and, you know, treating it through a medicalized lens. So this is a problem. I have money from Templeton for this big database project that I run. It looks at the history of religion. But yeah, my guess would be that they wouldn't want to fund things that look at chemical intoxicants because it's kind of taboo topic. And it's, you know, you see this in religious studies. So I talk about, you know, Mircea Eliade, the classic huge study of shamanism. He never mentions chemical intoxicants, even though all the people he's talking about were high out of their minds when they were doing all these rituals, except at a couple points where he's like, you know, present day shamans use drugs to get to the state, but this is fake mysticism. So there is this kind of weird, and I attribute it to this kind of neo-Puritanism where we're uncomfortable talking about these substances. And it's scientifically wrong. It's a blind spot in research that's a problem. So I'm hoping, I mean, one side effect of drunk is I'm hoping that people in my field will start to get more comfortable looking, you know, when they describe rituals, not just describing the marching and the singing and the dancing, but also the fact that everyone's drinking stuff out of cups while they're doing that. You know, that's got, you know, psychedelics or alcohol in it.
Yeah, exactly. And part of I'll leave it for hopefully another time, and I'll get in touch so that not everybody has to hear about the funding woes but also you know, strategies. One of the things I'd love to talk to you about is because in psychology and clinical psychology, shrooms or psilocybin and ketamine and LSD are being used now therapeutically and are getting some good results out of Johns Hopkins and other places, that there is a backdoor interesting way of thinking about well-being and mental health and the spiritual practices that for that. Anyway, that it gets a lot deeper in terms of the rationale of a kind of grant for that. But I think there is an interesting inroad there just because of that more lax world of clinical. I have another, I actually was going to just comment very briefly on the grant, but I'll open it to everybody else and then come back to my main question, which was not a funding one.
JP, did you have something you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, I had two questions. One is there, I was thinking of the Why We Sleep book, and there was a bunch of policy recommendations there, like don't force kids to get up too early when they're night owls. I only got a quarter way through the book, so did you have any kind of like policy stuff on that? And then the second one was again a Why We Sleep, like Matt Walker got a bunch of debunking things, and I was wondering whether anyone came out really strongly, had any really strong opinions on what you've written.
Yeah, in terms of concrete policy recommendations, I've got a few at the end. Some have to do with this issue of balancing the playing field between drinkers and non-drinkers. So, historically, alcohol's had this role socially. We now recognize that there's lots of reasons people wouldn't want to drink. And so how can we capture the benefits of alcohol-enabled sociality while not prejudicing things against non-drinkers too much, or at all, ideally. I have like a weirdly specific policy recommendation, which is that servers in the US who are involved in serving and work at places that serve alcohol should get a proper wage instead of relying on tips. So I argue that there's this bartenders and cocktail servers are serving this role that used to be served by kind of the head of the ritual in the traditional society. They should be helping people not drink too much. And yet, I worked in the service industry in San Francisco for a very long time when I was in school, and I survived entirely on tips. And I was making an alternate minimum wage. This was back, I'm pretty old, so this was like in the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s. I was making, I think, $1.50 or $1.75 an hour because I was expected to make all of my money on tips. And the way you make tips is getting the bill run up. The way you get the bill run up is encourage people to drink alcohol. And that has the dual effect of running up their bill and making them happier and less inhibited, so you get better tips. It was against my interest in every possible way to cut off someone who was drinking too much. It would have been very, very counterproductive for me, and possibly resulted in me not making any money on that customer. And that's a perverse system. It's basically a system that's designed to get people drunk. So this just seems like a trivial thing, but just having a system more like Europe, where servers are making a proper salary and tips are just an extra thing, I think would reduce drunk driving, reduce bar fights, would have all these kind of knock-on positive effects. So I think that you need, in order to see how much more, avoid drinking alone. So see that we have this modern problem of drinking in isolation without social controls that's historically novel and really dangerous for people, as we've seen in the pandemic. So problem drinking really went through the roof during the pandemic. Is actually a nice natural experiment. You'd never get human subject approval to run this, right? But it happened that, hey, let's see what happens if we make everyone stay home for a year and they can get out as much alcohol as they want. Let's see what happens to drinking patterns. It turns out really bad. And then spirits. So somebody put that in the chat. The other big modern danger is this relatively recent problem of distilled liquors. So even though they're just ethanol, the same way that beer is, those distilled liquors are so much more powerful. There's orders of magnitude more powerful than beers and wines, that they should really be treated as a different drug. And this is actually one way in which it's concretely impacted my life. Is I'm a wine drinker. I really like wine, and I really like spirits. I'm a Scotch drinker. I really like cocktails, and I've never drank much beer, but I've actually consciously started drinking beer more. And even at events that I'm in charge of, consciously choose to get the table, like if I have a group of postdocs and people together, get beer instead of wine or cocktails, because it's just safer. Beer is actually a better drug. It's a better way to deliver alcohol because it's weaker, and it helps you kind of stay at that sweet spot of mild inebriation. Whereas if you're doing shots of something, you can just blow past the sweet spot right into dangerous territory very quickly. So yeah, there's a bunch of practical stuff later in the book. In terms of pushback, I've gotten surprisingly little pushback, professionally, academically, on the central arguments of the book. And I've gotten what I expected and didn't get as much as I thought was angry responses from people who are recovered alcoholics or the children of alcoholics or friends of alcoholics, people who are very personally acquainted with the dangers of alcohol, who would be outraged that I was arguing that alcohol can play a positive role in our lives. And I have gotten those messages. I've gotten, there have been letters to the editor to newspapers that have published interviews with me saying that people have canceled their subscriptions because it's so horrible that I'm advocating alcohol use. But I do think I'm clear enough in the book that the reason I'm writing it is because this is a super dangerous substance and it can lead to all these bad consequences. And so there's a mystery about why we use it. And there's every culture that uses the substance is worried about it. Every culture that uses alcohol surrounds its use with all sorts of ritual restrictions and concerns because they're aware that it could be, it has benefits, but it's also a two-sided thing. So, the way I put it at one point is that, the Greeks worship Dionysus as a god and were thankful for the benefits that Dionysus brought. But they're also a little afraid of him. He could be dangerous, and the gifts that he gave you could be two-sided. And his followers could be, you don't want to run into his followers in the woods late at night. So there was this edge of danger to Dionysus that is healthy and that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about alcohol.
Just to pick up on one question, or to extend JP's point, I wondered if you could comment on the idea about spirits being particularly harmful for young people to do with the prefrontal cortex, because I found that interesting in the book, but I don't know whether you went quite as far as making that a sort of policy recommendation.
Yeah. Alcohol is targeting your prefrontal cortex. If you've got a fully developed one, that's less of a problem. If it's in the process of developing, and maybe Isabella can speak to this, you don't want to be throwing a lot of poison at it that's targeting that particular part of the brain. And again, spirits are doing that with this specificity and power that we're just not genetically equipped to deal with. We evolved to deal with small amounts of alcohol and overripe fruit. Our primate ancestors adapted to that. I think it's possible that modern humans have adapted to stronger, deliberately produced versions of alcoholic beverages. But those have been historically like 2 to 3% ABV beers and maybe slightly stronger fruit wines. When you get this, 98% ABV vodka and you're shooting that back, you're just flooding your system with ethanol at a level it can't deal with. And one of the things it's doing is going in and pounding your prefrontal cortex. And so people who are under 20, mid 20s who don't have fully developed PFCs, it's a really dangerous thing to do. And I don't know, developmentally, it just seems to me that there's, when you're still developing a brain region, it's vulnerable to, that process of development's vulnerable to being thrown off. And one way to throw it off seems to me to be imbibing an intoxicant that's targeting it. So this is a real issue for me with my daughter, because she's 15, going on 16, and she's been experimenting with drinking, and her friends are doing it too. And I was a real dork as a teenager. I don't experientially get it. I was home reading Carl Jung and studying Taoism when I was at her age, but I was also a dork. And I realized that she's much more popular and cool than I was at that age. But I'm really trying to emphasize with her to avoid hard spirits, to avoid cocktails, because they're so dangerous. And if you're going to go out and experiment with drinking a little bit with your friends, beer is safer.
Anna, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I have a comment about kind of, group regulation at a time when we don't necessarily have group regulation. And I just read this article that actually it's not solitary drinkers who are most at risk to die of drinking these days, but it's couples. So apparently in the UK, what used to be the 20-year-old young white man to be most kind of a danger to die of alcohol consumption now is a 60-year-old couple who drink a bottle of wine every night. And that seems to be a pandemic thing. So one thing that I really, it's kind of an internal debate for me, because I hate St. Patrick's Day. I hate Notting Hill Carnival. I hated when I lived in London and this, special police force kind of have to march up because they are preparing for people getting drunk on a certain, night of the year. But there was something about seasonality. I think that the ancients got better than us, that there's drinking and then there's drinking every day. And I don't think that we should drink every day. I don't think that we should necessarily drink every month, or not, whatever your communities or your, personal lives, alcohol regulation is, to do that. We have, every culture has fasting around food. We should also have maybe detox periods, which is something that I've been doing myself. A lot of people in the community started doing it around the pandemic because they just noticed that this is getting out of hand. And whilst I understand that we can't return to an agricultural society's calendar, and we shouldn't, there's something to say about, I think, policy level encouraging people to think about the year as a kind of cycle where there will be times when you will drink more for social, ritualistic, spiritual reasons, and that's amazing. And then there is something that's called Tuesday, and you should go to the gym and then take a bath and, I don't know, watch Big Bang Theory and, play Scrabble with your wife, whatever it is that relaxes you on that night. And I don't know if there's a secular way to talk about the kind of liturgic calendar, but I think we should.
Yeah, there is, right? There's, these dry Januaries. There are these movements to, incorporate deliberate abstaining from alcohol into your lives. So I think people are trying to work on that. And also cultures, the stuff you're talking about with festivals, these are these periodic times when, groups create an opportunity for communal ecstasy. And those are inherently not something you do every day, right? Society wouldn't work very well if you're doing that every day. And so they tend to be these periodic festivals where, and often, it involves relaxing rules temporarily, or subverting them even. So cultures have been pretty smart about that, giving people these opportunities for group ecstasy while ideally having periods where we fast or we engage in and penitence or whatever. So yeah, I think there's secular ways of doing that as well.
It's much easier to do together. The same way as we distrust the non-drinker in the group where we are like talking nonsense at 2 a.m. The same way it's much easier to abstain together.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So it's really hard for an individual to do it ad hoc, but if you make it a ritual and you know everyone's doing it, it's easier. Yeah. Isabella?
Yeah, this is on a different note, but I was thinking about when you talked about, it's going back to the developmental point and Gopnik's work. And so she, as you all know, and you sort of you do mention it and talk about it, she's got this, well, she's got lots of data and this theoretical perspective around consciousness where in childhood and adolescence, the brain acts as this kind of explore machine, right? So it's more flexible, it's more creative, it's more all that. And you review beautifully. I first of all, I just love the book, by the way. I like your writing style. I like the rigor of the research. And I really like your voice throughout the book and the fact that you make it personal and engaging and just delightful. And I've read a lot of, academic books, but also ones for the layperson. I just think you've got a really, really fantastic balance there that I just really appreciated. So
great. Thanks. Yeah. It's also good editing.
Yeah. Well, I'm the wife of an academic as well, and I've done that editing as well. Right? So also around substance use and abuse. So it's interesting parallel, but sorry. So sticking to this explore exploit thing, you've got, I want to think with you and ask you the question around basically ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny when it comes to the role of alcohol and not so much intoxication, but the role of the explore exploit modes in the mind, right? So in development, you've got this period of extended, as you say, neonatal and further basically immaturity of the mind and the brain. And you have this period that it's characterized by more of this explore mode, this more flexibility, cognitive flexibility, et cetera. And that flips into adulthood at around 22 to 25 into the adult mode of much more exploit, focused, attention is focused, a lot of the miscellany and lateral thinking is decreased, et cetera, right? So you have this move from an explore to an exploit kind of consciousness in ontogeny. Now in phylogeny, evolutionarily, my question to you is, this is a very weird question, but anyway, whether you could see the parallel there where that early on up to, let's say, I don't know, 1,000 years, maybe a couple hundred years ago, all this evolutionary time, there is a really great function to using alcohol for this breaking down of our PFC, for this lateral thinking across groups, even not just individual lateral thinking, but the ability as a social group to come up with new strategies for, I don't know, war, but also religions and technologies and all sorts of things. And shaking it up really well in terms of cultural evolution, you require these kind of strategies to keep in that explore mode, and you use alcohol for it. But that maybe there is a period in the last 100 years or so that we're starting into where, because it's gone too far into spirits, there is now a necessity to strangle that kind of explore mode and think around the explicit ritualistic cultural sort of lessons that could be, or cultural packages, I think Henrik uses, around not using alcohol and keeping into a more exploit mode at certain periods much more intentionally. I don't know if you know where I'm getting to, because of course I'm talking about this as if this is somehow goal oriented, and that's not at all what I'm obviously not talking about evolution as this so what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I mean, we always use intentional language to talk about evolution because it's a good shorthand, but we understand it's a blind process of random variation combined with selection pressure. So there could be, if I understand your question, there could be it's possible there's been cultural evolutionary pressure in the last few hundred years to hem in alcohol consumption or surround it with more restrictions as a response to the enhanced danger of distilled spirits. It's even possible that there's been a genetic response to this. So I talk in the book about this, the Asian flushing syndrome is usually what it's called, but this set of two different mutations that interfere with alcohol metabolism. And this is the solution, you say, well, why do we drink? Well, because it makes us feel good. It doesn't have to. And in fact, people with this condition, it doesn't feel good. It makes them feel horrible. And so they don't drink. This particular set of mutations arose somewhere around modern day Shanghai, 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, probably around the time that rice agriculture is getting off the ground. It has a strong selective signal, so it clearly was selected for something. There's debate about what that could be. It could be possibly tuberculosis resistance, because you've got people living in these tight groups doing agriculture for the first time. But it's been preserved in East Asia, and it has spread. So it's spread into northern China, Japan, Korea. And I do have two colleagues who have argued that this is because distilled spirits started in East Asia. They were the first people to figure out how to make distilled spirits on a large scale, possibly as far back as the Tang Dynasty. So maybe way earlier than in Europe. And they think that this is a genetic response. The fact that this was preserved, it was preserved in East Asia for reasons we don't understand, but its expansion to a broader, because now when we look at the genetic distribution now, we're just looking at contemporary populations. They're saying this is a reflection of how it's spread in response to distillation. So you could have, it's possible, and of course then cultural evolution is much faster than genetic evolution. So you could have both things happening. In East Asia, this genetic response, and more broadly, a kind of cultural evolutionary response. And I hadn't thought about this before, that maybe this kind of neo-Puritanism, kind of cultural queasiness about alcohol is actually an adaptive cultural response to the fact that it's just a much more dangerous thing these days. That's a cool idea. And that's totally possible, especially given how quickly cultural evolution can work. But yeah, alcohol is a much more dangerous substance than it used to be. Yeah, so in the Tang, we've got, Bryan gave us the dates of the Tang. We've got accounts of distillation in some texts, and we also, the main signal of this is the banquet cups become very small. And that's because you don't need very much anymore. So they've clearly kind of figured out how to condense alcohol into distilled spirits. So if that's the case, if they were making it, in whatever, the 700-800s AD, that's almost 1,000 years earlier than in Europe. So that's certainly enough time for genetic evolution to start doing some stuff. Is there a way, once we end this Zoom,
Yes.
Is there a way to keep the chat?
Yeah, we will.
Because there's all this stuff here that I can't follow it, but I'd love to save it. There's a way to save the chat?
I will save it for you and send it to you. Yep.
Great. Yeah, there's some cool stuff there.
Isabella, did you have any another follow-up or?
No, it's just, it is really, really fascinating. And I guess the only follow-up questions, and again, I think it's too specific for this conversation, is whether the database that you just completely tantalizingly talked about around the Templeton Foundation had any kind of data sets where these kinds of hypotheses could be kind of untangled, where you look at when more puritanical sort of viewpoints around alcohol, and also in specific places around the world, and whether you could somehow look at correlations around that, and even sequential analyses of these kinds of things.
Yeah, so the database of religious history is what it's called, is precisely that. It's designed to gather data about religious belief and practice across the world throughout history, so diachronically. In a way, the original purpose of it was so that you could test hypotheses, cultural evolutionary hypotheses, against other sorts of data, climate data or whatever. The problem is the current polls, so we have a variety of these sets of questions that we call polls, doesn't have a lot of information about intoxicants. So there, in the group poll, there is a question about whether or not they use chemical intoxicants in their rituals. There's also questions about prohibitions on chemical intoxicants. So we do have that data. So you could use that to then correlate with other types of data and test these. That's the idea behind this resource, is that you can finally, because it's in quantitative form, you can test hypotheses against it. So basically what we have is an expert. I'm an expert on an early Chinese religion. I answer questions about that religion, all in yes, no, I don't know, field doesn't know format. Like click a radio button. That gives you the quantitative data. And then I can also make a comment about it. So that gives you qualitative information. And all of those answers are grounded in space and time. So my group has a GIS map attached to it and a date range attached to it. So that allows you to then test hypotheses about the cultural evolutionary dynamics in a rigorous way for the first time ever. The problem is we've been around for 10 years now, and we're only just now getting enough data for us to be useful. We have some of the first analyses are coming out right around now, because we've been expert focused, so we're having experts doing the coding, and it's really hard to get historians and archaeologists to do this kind of stuff. So we've been involved in this decade-long effort to kind of convince people that this is worthwhile and it's not evil scientific reductionism. But yeah, we're in year 10. We just had a big conference, and where we were like, the guy Mike Krishna, who built it as a grad student originally, he looked somewhere in GitHub or somewhere. He's like, yeah, I wrote the first lines of code 10 years ago. So it's been a decade.
Awesome.
Cool.
Really cool. Thank you.
But you could, if you were interested in this, we host polls from outside research groups. And so we have people, for instance, we have one group who's interested in prayer. They want to study communications with the divine. And so they want to come up with a much more detailed questionnaire about that topic and use the database to gather that data and display it. You could imagine doing something like that for chemical intoxicants, where you just have much more detailed questions about which substances are being used, what sort of restrictions around them. That would be really neat.
Well, and again, and like linking it to things like explore, exploit, period, in different areas of the world. Okay, I'll just come and get in touch with you, because this is also stuff that I've talked to Bryan. I've talked to Bryan about in terms of these exact specific periods in cultural history and so on. And so he's got, as he obviously has, all these dates that are very specific around where you might consider what these civilizations and societies are doing at different periods. So anyway, I will leave the floor to others, but thank you for the answer.
Yeah, I'm very excited to pose some questions to that too. JP, you had a question in the chat, I think.
Yeah, I was in France over the summer, and I found this map of like 1852 where it had all the vineyards in France. It's like Napoleon basically mapped all of France and put all that crazy stuff. And then the phylloxera came in and wiped everything out and everything changed. And as you were talking about data stuff, I did a bunch of land cover mapping in a previous life, and I was wondering, like, how much I see, like, this many acres of forest allocated to this particular agricultural product. I've not seen a figure for booze. Like, how much land is for making booze?
That would be cool to find out, because it's part of my arguments is that it's very costly just economically. I do have so there's one estimate of ancient Sumer that half of their grain production went to making alcohol, went to making beer. But what that translates to, it'd be interesting to look at that as an acreage percentage, like whether of cultivated land or just space in general. But you could also look at it as a proportion of kind of people labor hours, like how much labor is put into producing alcohol. Those would be really interesting numbers to have.
Yeah. I mean, you got to do the sort of land cover map and then the supply chain analyses on the back of it. I've gone out of that field, but I know some geeks who work on that stuff.
And especially if you had that data with some historical depth, that would be interesting.
You could probably, on a global level, you could go back to 1984 with the satellite data stuff.
Sure.
And then before then, you're kind of scraping.
It's going to be really tricky. It's going to be really tricky to get any good data. I mean, in China, you might have a better chance because we've got these local gazetteers that go back in some cases like almost 1,000 years, where local officials are reporting on the products that are made in there, but we wouldn't have detailed maps of kind of areas.
And I'm just thinking a sort of graph of looking at the carbon. You get the carbon intensity of GDP. Hopefully that's going down. I wonder if there's a booze intensity of GDP.
That's cool. That's a really neat idea. Yeah, that's very cool. And seeing how it varies cross-culturally.
Lucas, you had your hand up.
Yeah, sure. I had one more question, and something I would be really curious about is, like, what is your opinion on trends in terms of alcohol consumptions as they continue into the future? Because as you mentioned in the book, alcohol is like the #1 intoxicant, but there are others. And so my impression is, because I've seen quite a few charts and statistics that say that alcohol consumption is decreasing, especially in younger people, which is like, it's a general trend. But at the same time, I'm seeing people are talking much more openly about experimenting with a lot of other intoxicants like psychedelics and all. And I'm curious if you think, like, looking into the short-term or even long-term future, if there's like human need for intoxication, if it's something which will generally reduce, or if it's just something that you would expect, okay, maybe part of it will just shift from alcohol to other drugs, or maybe if you even think, okay, maybe it's like a short-term trend, but in the long term, you don't expect consumption to go down.
Yeah, I think it's a structural part of human life, and so I don't expect the overall need to go down. But there's other drugs that could do the same job. I talk at the end of the book about the possibility that they're just safer drugs. I mean, maybe we could synthesize something that has a lot of the effects of alcohol, but isn't addictive physically and is not harmful physiologically in the way that alcohol is. I talked specifically about psilocybin and the fact that in its natural form, it's just so powerful that we can't use it socially. But we now can synthesize the active ingredient and dose it and put it in little capsules. And so maybe microdosing psilocybin will get us a lot of the benefits that alcohol has given us without any of the costs. Psilocybin is not harmful physiologically, and it's not addictive. There's also, non-chemical intoxicant ways to do this too. So, extreme exercise can put you into these state of minds. Rituals that involve sleep deprivation or pain can get you into this state of mind. So there are other ways you could do it. I think, and I think partly the move away from alcohol is it's not a cool drug anymore. So I think young people view it as kind of their boring uncle's drug, not something that they want to do. And they want to do cannabis, they want to do dab pens or whatever. But I don't think the overall need for intoxication is going to change dramatically unless we become very different types of creatures. We're always going to need that vacation from the self. We're always going to need some way to get otherwise potentially hostile individuals to cooperate. I don't think the overall need is going to go away.
I had a
maybe on that
question.
note. So we're at. Oh, you have one. Yeah.
Oh yeah, just one final one, and then yeah, we can wind down. The only thing it just occurred to me right now, because I was thinking about this issue of, downregulating the prefrontal cortex, kind of returning you to youth. I was just thinking about, some fields tend to, people tend to peak earlier, whether it's, I think, music and poetry and maybe mathematics or things like that. People tend to do better earlier on. And I was just thinking to myself, like, whereas novelists tend to peak later. And I was just wondering if you've done any thinking about whether there are certain fields that might reward drinking more than others. It was just a completely, a thought that came to me in a second.
I think, yeah, no, absolutely. I think creative fields. So fields that require lateral thinking. So that's going to be any kind of artistic field, but it's going to be technical fields where you need, an insight, not just, powering through A, B, C, D to some solution. So yeah, I think there's a reason, that's a reason that historically alcohol has been associated with artists and poets and creative types, because they're in a job that requires lateral thinking, and the PFC gets in the way of lateral thinking. So they're going to do things that help them to tune that down when they need to.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for coming. Do you have any sort of final comments or anything that you'd like to say before we stop recording?
Oh, this was great. I mean, amazing questions. I can't wait to go through the chat. There's all this information here that I could use, but really, really thought-provoking questions. And I'm glad that we managed to find a time to do this.
Thank you so much for the discussion.
Okay, thanks everybody.